お母さん、おばあちゃん、ひさこ決めた。制服を着て、友達を集めて、ひさこ、学校に行く。
Hello everybody and welcome to this video in which I'm going to kill two birds with one stone. I'm going to talk about a new game that has just released. That's the one you're seeing on the screen in front of you right now. It's called Dead or School and it's not bad, but I haven't got too much to say about it in addition to a review that I've already done. So I will cover it briefly because that's the news angle, but I'm also going to talk about a more general topic which comes up fairly often with the games that I play and review, and it is of interest to me because yeah, it's a fascinating topic, so we'll get to that shortly. But first, let's talk about Dead or School. So Dead or School is basically what would happen if you took the Metro series of first-person shooters and gave them anime boobs. The humans of the world have been driven underground by an apocalypse of mutants that have invaded and taken over the surface, and they now live in the subway of Tokyo, which is where the Metro reference comes in. You play as a girl who's decided she wants to go to the surface and reclaim it because she's been told of this magical place called a school by her grandmother. Now, a school to her means this place to go with friends in safety and learn about things, go to clubs, have fun, all of that kind of stuff, go to after school activity clubs, I mean. And on that promise, she's taken up a sword, a gun and whatever, and she's now got to slay her way through entire hordes of mutants on her way to find a place to go to school. It is very trashy and nonsense, and unlike Metro, which is fairly seriously themed, this one doesn't take itself seriously by any means. And it wears its inspiration really on its sleeve. It is designed after the kind of the trashiest of B-grade stuff. And if you played Schoolgirl Zombie Hunter beforehand, it's basically pitched exactly the same space as that. It doesn't have the production values of a lot of other games. It was actually a failed Kickstarter. But the development team kind of stuck with it and they were able to get it out in the end. And it's actually very playable. In my review, I give it 3 out of 5 stars, so it's by no means a classic, but it does achieve what it wants to. It controls nicely enough, it's enjoyable to play, and it will make you laugh. It is silly in the right way. So as long as you're a fan of the kind of B-grade exploitation stuff, you will appreciate what this game kind of offers. The other thing about the game is it is so heavily kind of focused on the school uniform thing and the school theme, and that's really where the other part of the video that I wanted to do comes in, because one of the things that often comes up with these kinds of Japanese games that are set in schools or the characters wear school uniforms is why the developers would do that, because there are connotations that certain people would suggest about the kind of school uniform plus the fan service, which makes people uncomfortable. And of course, if you are uncomfortable with it, fair enough, but I don't think necessarily that the intent of these developers with this stuff is what people assume. And I've spoken to quite a few game developers about the topic in the past, why they keep setting games in schools, why the uniform, why mix that in with fan service and all that, and it is an interesting discussion to have. So one of the first things to note with the school uniform fetish is that it is by no means an uncommon one. In fact, it would have to be one of the most common. There are of course plenty of uniform fetishes, ranging from flight attendants to nurses to office workers, cheerleaders, cosplayers, fantasy cosplayers, and so on and so forth. But school uniforms would have to be the most frequently occurring of all of these. As to why people develop a thing for uniforms, I'm no psychologist, but I have read quite a lot on the topic as it does interest me a great deal, and from what I have read, the science doesn't seem to be too settled there. What people do know is that fetishes tend to manifest through adolescence, when people develop their sexual identities, and then tend to stick with a person through life. So it would make sense that the uniform kink probably comes from being in the presence of uniforms when that kink is being developed. Most people go to school, of course, and most schools, especially in Japan, have uniforms. What's more, they tend to be quite fashionable over there, and girls will often choose a school, or at least try to choose a school, based on the uniform that they'd get to wear. And that would be the main thing that you'd see your classmates in as you're going through school. So it would make sense that people would start to associate their sense of attraction and aesthetics with seeing a uniform. Then what happens later on in life is that school becomes very nostalgic. People tend to remember the good times of their school lives, and that blending of nostalgia with the memory of the aesthetic attraction that people had to a crush when they saw her in her uniform makes for a really powerful double whammy. So for example, when I spoke to the developers of Galgun at TGS one year, the nostalgia of the school experience was actually what they were trying to tap into. It wasn't about the fan service necessarily, it was about that sense of nostalgia. Now what's really important to note here is that the school uniform fetish is by no means the same thing as a school girl fetish. There's a Japanese photographer called Aoyama Yuki who has created some amazing photo books in a series called Schoolgirl Complex that actually explore this exact idea and really make it clear. The photography is always very highly fetishistic of girls in uniforms posing and playing, but the photo never actually captures their face. You actually have no idea who that person is. It's always a look purely at the uniform, highlighting how much of a fetish that uniform is aesthetically, but making it quite clear that that response that you have to see in that photo, whether you find it uncomfortable or not, is completely irrelevant to who is inside that uniform. And it's for these reasons that I find it a bit surprising that school uniform fan service in video games gets so heavily criticized. I don't think people really think about these things very clearly. There seems to be this idea that enjoying games with fan servicey school uniform elements says something really unpleasant about the player, but I'd actually really challenge that. For one thing, video games in a very real and very extreme sense fetishize violence. The developers of the likes of Call of Duty go out of their way to entirely to make their guns feel as good as possible to fire off. They need to be visceral, they need to be powerful, they need to be very realistic and authentic, I guess. Levels in those games are also always so carefully designed to pump adrenaline through the body throughout the entire level, and yet people who enjoy violent video games aren't likely to go on a gun-toting massacre by any means. I mean, the science is quite clear on that. There's been an awful lot of studies that have gone to show that exact thing. But equally, someone who enjoys Dead or School is not liable to go start stalking a high school. That's just as unrealistic. In fact, as a society outside of video games, we actually understand that. We understand that firstly, fetishes are a healthy way of someone exploring and enjoying their sexuality, and secondly, for the overwhelming majority of people, a fetish is a harmless fantasy and in no way related to how a person thinks or behaves in the real world outside of the bedroom as such. People can have some truly out there fetishes. S&M, for example, is another very common one, but a person that enjoys S&M is not likely to go and beat up strangers for sexual gratification. Other people are exhibitionists or like the idea of sex in public, but they're not going to go and start stripping off every time they go shopping. Some people even enjoy play acting rape, for an extreme example, but that's very different from actually wanting that outside of the play act. And I think outside of video games, again, people understand that uniform fetishes are no different. A person might have a nurse uniform fetish, for example, but that doesn't mean that they're going to go and rub against a nurse every time they go to a hospital. Flight attendants don't need to worry about some random deviant with a thing for that uniform jumping on them. And the school uniform fetish, likewise, means absolutely nothing in a real-world context. Now, of course, it is possible for these things to get to the point they're unhealthy. There is a small number of people that do take things way too far, and those people really do need help, of course. But that also applies to violent media, and again, American developers have a fetish for bloodlust that runs rings around the Japanese games, and the fetish that those sometimes have for school uniforms. The point I'm making here through all of this is pretty simple. It's fine if games like Dead or Schoolgirl Zombie Hunter or whatever else make you feel uncomfortable. You don't have to play these games, and that's kind of the joy of video games. There are plenty of other ones you can play instead. It would, however, be helpful to understand that the jump that many people make from finding these games distasteful to casting a moral judgment on those that do enjoy them is a jump that's largely grounded in ignorance and a wild set of assumptions that simply do not play out in the real world like people assume they would. So right now, here in Australia, we've got a senator that's campaigning for a wide range of anime that cover these kinds of themes to be banned, outright banned. So the topic is actually as relevant now as when I first wrote about it about 10 years ago. So it's getting to become a very tired topic, but I've got to keep paying attention to it because it keeps coming up. I've always wondered why certain voices campaign against this stuff. And if you put aside the likelihood that it's just because they find the material grotesque and therefore nobody should see it, the only other explanation that could make any sense whatsoever is that they actually believe that this kind of material will turn people into deviants, and that's just nonsense. There's nothing harmful in a game like Dead or School, Schoolgirl Zombie Hunter, Galgun, Blue Reflection, or any similarly themed anime. These people are just having a puritanical response to a perfectly harmless fantasy. And that's basically everything I had to say on that topic. So you would have seen from this video that I've gone and taken a bit of a best of list of games that are available on PlayStation 4 and also make a point of using school uniform fan service. And one of the things that is pretty common to them is that they're all quite funny by design. So to bring it back to Dead or School, it's a blatant bit of satire, and I think that's something that a lot of people often overlook. These games aren't meant to be titillating or sexy as much as they're just being playfully stupid with a theme. Whether they're successful or not is another matter, of course, but that's what they're trying to do. There is a chasm between what these games offer and the games that are actually pornographic in tone, and that context is really important to how we should look at these games and the supposed impact that they're going to have on the audience. And that's something that the Australian Senator is really ignoring with his complaint about all this anime, and he's trying to analyse artwork without context, which is really poor and ignorant analysis of art. It doesn't really matter if you personally think that the art that you're looking at is perverse or grotesque. If you're not able to apply a basic level of critical thought to understand the context, or at least try to, then you really shouldn't be judging art. So much of the best art out there is subversive, in that it depicts things that, within the text itself, it's actually criticising. And just as we now acknowledge the Marquis de Sade as a kind of artist, that same principle applies to a lot of these games. They're satirical, or they're critical, or they're even socially politically aware. They are not serious. The only exception to this, of course, is Blue Reflection, which is also in this video and isn't satirical in tone, but then Blue Reflection is just the most beautiful thing, and it's very much about the aesthetic rather than the sexual. It's definitely not meant to be a sexy game either, but it is certainly a beautiful girl game. As part of the, I guess, the magical girl tradition, they're always quite beautiful. Anyway, I've rambled on enough about this video, so hopefully it was interesting. It's a topic that obviously interests me a great deal, so thank you for tuning in and watching. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoy my videos. They encourage me to do more. Every subscriber is a thumbs up as far as I'm concerned. And if you do enjoy my videos and want to consider kind of helping me out so I can dedicate more time to this stuff, please do consider backing me on Patreon. Even $1 a month is a huge help. As always, thank you for watching, and we'll see you at the next video.